Yes, well, one of the common excuses for not believing in plain, ordinary 6 days, as set out in Genesis 1, is that, well, maybe Genesis is just symbolic. And if someone says that to you, well, you can politely ask them, symbolic of what? It certainly can't be evolution, because if you look at even just the sequence of events with the standard evolutionary story, it doesn't fit. And it doesn't take long for the people who want to believe that to realize that, no, that's not going to work. So there are all sorts of other theories that people have come up with to try and explain away. How can we avoid being confronted with very clear language? And here are a couple of them, or one particular one that's become quite popular in recent days, but it's not completely new. It actually goes back probably over 100 years. But anyway, it's the idea that Genesis 1 is really just a literary framework. It's to tell us a bit about God's character and a bit about his power. So we have statements like these. This is a question that was actually sent into the Ask site. Are there two parallel symbolic lists of 3 days of forming and 3 days of filling? Now, what do they mean by that? What does that question mean? Well, here are a couple of examples of explanations from theologians, and you can find the source books, the sources of these quotes actually on the Ask site. And one is an explanation, well, what is formed, in other words, what is made on day 1 is filled on day 4, and the same on days 2 and 5 and 3 and 6. So the idea is that there's sort of two parallel lines of one to do with filling the forming the earth and the creation, and the other to do with using it or filling it. And so you will come across this idea, and it can be summarized a bit like this. You can sort out the 6 days of creation into two parallel lists of 3. So you start off with, on the first day, God made the heavens, the earth, and the light. And on the 4th day, so into the second column there, God made the sun and the moon and the stars. And then if we go down, on the second day, God played with water. No, he did. He didn't just do that, right? God, in his power, moved water around on the earth, and that's a reminder that there was always enough water on the earth for to cover the earth at Noah's flood. Noah's flood was not the first time the earth was completely covered with water, another story. But anyway, God moved the water around so that there was waters above and below with a layer in between. And then in that second series of events, God made the sea creatures and the flying creatures. And then finally, God made the land and the sea and the plants. And in the second series of events there, God made the land animals and the human beings. So there is a sort of symmetry there, but let's scrutinize it a little bit more tightly. So let's look at days 1 and days 4. All right, God made the sun, the moon, and the stars, which are located in the heavens, or what we would call outer space, and they were designed to give light on the earth. So there's a sort of match there between God making the heavens and the things that are located in the heavens and give light on the earth. But if you look at it a little bit more detailed, the light was already made on day 1. In fact, that's one of the phrases that a lot of people who know nothing about the Bible will remember, right? Let there be light. It's come into common parlance, right? That happened on day 1. One of the excuses for not believing that Genesis is literal is to say that, well, it's just to describe why God created things. Well, there is one verse in the Bible, in Genesis, that does describe why God created things. The rest of it just tells you what he did and what he said about it. But this was to serve as signs, right? Let them serve or let them be for signs. Now, who are the signs for? Who's being served? Well, it can't be God because he knew what it was for. So who are they for? Well, obviously they're for people because they're timekeeping things, they're to do with seasons. And of course, we know that there are signs in the sky which have theological meaning as well. So they're signs for people, but people didn't appear on the earth until day 6. So there's a bit of a mismatch there. It doesn't really fit. What about days 2 and 5? Well, all right, God made the sea creatures and they live in the waters below, and God made the birds that fly in the sky or in the atmosphere. Okay, so they're in the layer that's above the waters, but nothing actually lives in the waters above. And the other interesting thing, of course, is that birds do not live in the atmosphere in the same way that fish live in the sea, right? Birds actually live on land and in trees, and both sea creatures and birds need vegetation for food and for habitat. They cannot exist without those things, and those things didn't exist, right? Vegetation for food and habitat didn't exist until the third day. So let's go to the third day, and sure enough, animals and humans live on the land. The land was made on the third day, right? And we eat plants and use plants for habitat. Again, link between the third day and the sixth day. But if we look at it with detail, remember the flying and swimming creatures also need plants. So the flying and swimming creatures were made on day 5. And human beings were told to rule over the fish, the birds, as well as the land animals. So there is not a clear match between days 3 and day 6. So it always does well to actually look at what the scriptures say and don't just take a superficial look at it and skim through it and ignore the bits that don't actually fit precisely, because God is very precise in what he says and we have to take it seriously. The Bible is not just a book of theological theory about God's character and his power. It's the real history of the real world. There are a few other questions that relate to this whole topic about, is Genesis 1 the real history of the real world, or is it just some sort of theological statement? A recent one we got was, is this just a polemic? Anyone know what a polemic is? All right. This was a statement from the person who wrote in, the early chapters of Genesis are a moral polemic against ancient pagan stories. So why do they have to be real history? This is an idea that somehow you have all of these pagan ideas floating around, and most of them are pretty ghastly and immoral. So God decided he had better provide a sort of cleaned up, nice sort of version for his chosen people. Well, that really does insult God, because it puts him on the back foot as, oh dear, then the human beings have invented a horrible story. I better clean it up and make a decent story. No, Genesis is the original. It's sinful human beings who have taken a good, clean story and ruined it with their sinful ideas. But you can read more about that on the Ask site, and there are various other questions that are related to the days of creation. And if you want to have a hard copy of that, go for our book, Your Questions Answered About Creation, and we look at these very issues. If we can